Northeast Wilderness Trust is a regional land trust. We're located in Montpelier, Vermont. We have a staff of 9 and a board of about the same number. But we work all across the Northeast in New York, primarily the Adirondacks, and all of New England. To date, we have conserved just over 37,000 acres in this territory, and we're working on many more. I think it's the total is over 15,000 that we're currently working on in the pipeline. So a lot of fun stuff coming up. We are the only regional land trust working in this space whose focus is solely on wilderness conservation. And what that means is that the lands that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects will never be logged. We don't manage in terms of cutting trees. They will never be developed or converted to another use. We like to say that they are the old growth forests of tomorrow. So they'll be returning to these old and very wild looking states that Mark will be sharing about. One of the exciting projects that we're working on right now is pictured right here in the screen you're viewing. So this is Grafton Forest. We're working to protect it as a wilderness preserve. Property is just over 1,300 acres in Maine's Mahoosic Range. It's right next to the Appalachian Trail. It provides home for dozens of breeding songbirds. The region is an important part of the northern forest in terms of where it lies on the migration corridor for many different types of animals. And the forest it's located within is home to the largest population of moose in the lower 48. So pretty incredible place. Without further ado, I'm very honored to introduce you to Mark Anderson. Mark is the Director of Conservation Science for the Nature Conservancy's Eastern U.S. region, where he provides science leadership, ecological analysis, and landscape assessment tools for conservation efforts across 22 states. His current research interests include ecological resilience, disturbance processes, geophysical landscape properties, and seafloor mapping. And when he's not busy with his full-time job, he also serves as the board president of Northeast Wilderness Trust, and we're just so lucky to have him in this role. Mark lives in coastal Massachusetts with his family, 2 goats, 3 cats, 1 dog, occasional chickens, a visiting pair of barred owls, and a lot of trees. Welcome, Mark. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Anderson. I'm the Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy's Eastern U.S. region, and I'm a board member for Northeast Wilderness Trust. And I'm here to talk to you today about wild carbon, the science behind carbon and conservation. We're going to talk a lot about trees and forests, and I want to start by reminding you that trees are living beings with their own evolutionary histories, their own way of communicating, their own social networks, their ways of taking care of each other, much of which we're just beginning to learn about. But if you go back in time far enough, we have a common ancestor. We diverged a long time ago, but trees and people are truly relatives. And trees and forests have so much to offer to the earth in terms of resilience and diversity, and there's ethical reasons for conserving them too. But today I'm going to focus very narrowly on carbon. But I think you'll see that the trees won't mind, because when it comes to trees and forests, carbon is us. So when I was in elementary school, Mrs. Pike taught me that trees use light to make food and release oxygen. And that was essentially right. I've learned the carbon cycle and the chemical reactions in much more detail as I went through graduate school, but it wasn't until I read the early scientific studies when carbon was figured out and photosynthesis was figured out, did it really dawn on me what we're talking about. And the first study was done in 1649 by 2 scientists, and they were asking the question, where does plant matter come from? Well, you've probably never thought about this question. If you're walking through the forest and you see trees around you, you think these trees grew up out of the ground. But trees do not grow up out of the ground. And they demonstrated this very clearly by a simple experiment, which I wish was done in every elementary school. What they did, they took a pot of soil and they weighed it carefully, 200 pounds of soil. And in that soil, they put a 5-pound willow sapling, which they also weighed carefully. And then they let the experiment run for 5 years, and they watered the plant. 5 years later, they removed the willow sapling and weighed it. It now weighed 169 pounds. And then they weighed the soil. It weighed the same, 200 pounds. It had lost 2 ounces, actually, 199.8. And they scratched their heads. They thought, this can't be. Where did the plant matter come from? Where did this tree come from? And eventually they wrongly concluded that it must have been in the water that they were watering this plant with. There must have been something in there that converted to plant. And it wasn't until 100 years later when Joseph Priestley actually figured out that the plants were coming out of the air. They are materializing out of the air around them through the process of photosynthesis, what we now call that, extracting carbon right out of the air and converting it into matter. So even when you see a huge tree like this or a gigantic forest, all of that biomass came out of the air around it. It materialized like Star Trek. So here we have an oak on a sunny day down by the Merrimack River. And my question for you, is what is this tree doing? Well, you can think of trees as living solar collectors. And what this tree, you can think of each leaf as a solar panel. And this is a sunny, bright day. It's got all of its solar panels out, and it is photosynthesizing like crazy. So it's extracting carbon out of the atmosphere. It's transferring it down through its trunk and roots, and it's releasing oxygen. What else is this plant doing? Well, it's also monitoring its visual environment. So we have photoreceptors in our eyes, and we can detect 4 types of light, red, green, blue, and also light dark. Plants have photoreceptors all over their bodies, mostly in their leaves, but bits on their trunks. And they can detect 11 wavelengths of light, including infrared and ultraviolet. And they have growth responses to every type of light. And long ago, this plant sensed that it had no trees around it and that it could spread out, and it did. It grew outward. And why did it do that? To maximize its solar panels, to collect the maximum amount of light so it can photosynthesize. What else is this tree doing? Well, it's also breathing. So, they don't have a respiratory system like we do, but all living cells really respire. They release carbon dioxide, and all the cells in this tree are respiring, as are the roots and the fine roots, and the trunk. And if you want to know how much carbon is being collected, it's really the amount of carbon being taken in through photosynthesis minus the amount of carbon being respired. So a very simple way to think about carbon is it's a function of that leaf area index. It's a function of the total amount of leaf area. And this was actually not understood for a while. There were a lot of debates about whether old trees, when trees get older, their metabolism slows down. And people thought, well, maybe their carbon collection slows down a little. But this was put to rest in 2014 in an article that came out in Nature, where the authors collected, it's called a meta-analysis. They collected all these other studies that looked at over 673,000 trees in 6 countries. And they measured, how much carbon was being sequestered, and they related it to the age of the trees. And they found that the rate of, the leaf area index far overwhelms any differences in metabolism. So even if this older tree slows down, the gains it gets in leaf area overshadows that. And they found this, they had a remarkable statement in their paper that said a single big tree can add the same amount of carbon to the forest within a year as is contained in an entire mid-sized tree. So that's like what this tree sequesters in 1 year is equal to growing an entire mid-sized tree in 1 year. Of course, you can't grow that tree in 1 year, but that's how much carbon. So here is Northeast Wilderness Trust property, Binney Hill. And finally, now you have enough background to answer the question, what is this hiker thinking? Awesome leaf area index. So she is seeing that there is a canopy, there's leaf spread out up in the upper canopy, there's a mid canopy, and then even down in the lowest canopy, there are shrubs, and they all have their leaves out, so they're maximizing their leaf area. And this is really the essential equation for sequestration, the annual uptake of carbon, is that a forest will attempt to maximize its leaf area. It can do it by its overall canopy, or it can do it in this diagram by getting layers, canopy layers of subcanopy and understory and shrub layers. And it's been found now and documented pretty well that structurally complex forests have a higher leaf area index, and therefore they use light more efficiently. But people have noticed, scientists and foresters have noticed that the growth of the trees does slow down as the trees and the stand gets older. So they begin to wonder, well, where does all the extra carbon go? It's not all going into tree growth. And that brings us to the second part of carbon understanding, which is storage. So if sequestration is how much a tree or a forest takes up every year, the storage is how do they accumulate and store that carbon? And that's done through what we call carbon pools. And part of the carbon pool is that above ground biomass, the trunk and the canopy. But there's also carbon pools in the woody debris on the ground, and then there are carbon pools underground in the soils, in the roots, in the fine roots. And it's the accumulation of all those carbon pools over time which tells you what the total carbon storage is. And of course, forests can store massive amounts of carbon, and we know that because, our two favorite fossil fuels, coal and petroleum, are both plant-derived. Coal is old swamps that were buried and compressed, and now that carbon, when they burn coal, it's being re-released into the atmosphere. And petroleum is buried in compressed, photosynthetic marine algae. And the same, when we burn it, we're re-releasing the carbon that was stored. And we know there are massive carbon pools in those two fuels. So a lot of recent research in carbon has to do with how trees transfer carbon to those different carbon pools over time. And the real breakthrough in this research came just recently in 2016 with Tamara Klein and her team in a published article in Science. They did this great experiment where using cranes, they released labeled carbon in the upper canopy of a forest, a temperate forest. And because the carbon was labeled, they could track it as it moved through the system. And what they found was that much of the carbon was transferred rather quickly down into the soil, and then 40% of that carbon was being shared with other trees nearby in the forest. In fact, the forest was working as like a giant organism where it was collecting and sharing carbon. And a lot more work now has gone into that, particularly by Susan Simard, who's actually, one of her students mapped that carbon sharing, this crazy graph you see up here, are the networks of shared carbon around one large old tree, which she calls a mother tree, you know. And what they found was that those big mother trees will actually share a lot of their carbon and support these growing saplings. And in fact, they found that slightly more water and nutrients were being given to their own offspring. So there is a lot we have to learn about how forests collect and share carbon. So, and you're probably wondering, how does this carbon sharing occur? Well, it really occurs through a mycorrhizal network. So first of all, remember that, roughly half of what you see above ground, there's an equal half of roots underground, particularly fine roots. And those roots are connected by a fungal network. It's called a mycorrhizal network that creates a tight association with the roots. And this has been known for a long time that, the trees actually transfer carbon to the fungal network as food, and the fungal network helps release nutrients and transfers those nutrients back up to the tree. And there's some nutrients that are hard to get a hold of, and the fungal network really is good at releasing those. And so it's a symbiotic beneficial relationship. But those fungal networks also connect roots across species and across individuals. And in the work I spoke about on the last slide, it was mixed species. So the carbon sharing is being mediated by this intense fungal network, which connects all of the underground resources, all of the underground roots of the forest. And there's a wonderful book that came out last year. If this interests you, it's called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. And it's a fascinating read. In that book, he talks about mycorrhizal networks as being more fundamental to plants than photosynthesis. So that's something to think about. But the fungal networks is another thing that really develops and grows as the forest grows and matures. And in a study done in 2017 by Mori et al., they found that after a forest gets cleared, it really degrades the fungal network. They become less connected, and the fungal network is less diverse. And that over time, as a forest ages, that network reconnects up, gets more diverse, and stores up a lot more carbon. So underground, that network is also helping store a lot of carbon. And of course, soil carbon is quite a topic in the world of agriculture right now, because it was very similar situation out on the prairies. You can see in this picture, the native plants of perennial wheatgrass, had huge root systems, and those root systems connected up with each other through mycorrhizal networks. And so the perennial grasslands, the native grasslands, stored a ton of carbon, whereas our more recent agricultural system favors annual plants with very small root systems, and we've lost a lot of the carbon. And we're trying to, no-till agriculture and other approaches are trying to rebuild soil carbon. I hope that approach really starts to get into forestry, because forestry so far has not paid much attention to soil carbon either. In fact, even though there's some studies showing that old growth forests have unexpectedly high rates of carbon, if you look at a forest, this is a U.S. Table for calculating carbon and estimating carbon in forests, came out in 2016. You'll see I circled the soil carbon is just a constant. There's no change in soil carbon in this chart from a young forest to an old forest. It's just treated as a constant, and it's a rather small one at that. So we have a lot to do to learn about how soil carbon works in forests. So a good way to think about it now, is that forests allocate their carbon at different ages. So forests allocate their carbon differently. When the stand is young, most of the carbon is allocated allocated to above ground growth. And you see these, these skinny trees up here with a lot of leaves, they're growing very fast, and that's where most of the carbon goes. But once the forest gets older, it shifts, and it's really allocating most of its carbon to the below ground soil and mycorrhizal network. And again, just like with the individual trees, there was a time when scientists and foresters thought, because the forest, the above ground growth slows down and the metabolism of each individual tree slows down, maybe the carbon just reaches an equilibrium and is not getting stored. But now we know that, in fact, it's as long as there's a huge leaf area, that carbon is being taken up every year, and it's being stored in some carbon pool. And the another meta study was done in 2008, where the scientists looked at 519 studies where they really measured all the carbon elements of the carbon pool. And it showed pretty conclusively that old forests, you see that the accumulate carbon for centuries and have large quantities of it. So you see here carbon sink is above this 0 line, carbon source is above. And there are a few old forests that are sources of carbon, and those are mostly related to a disturbance event. We'll talk about that in a minute. But far and away, these old forests just store those carbon pools over long periods. Okay, well, that brings me to the most common question I get, which actually comes out. There's a great little document on forest carbon, Catanzaro and D'Amato, 2019. It was Amherst, University of Massachusetts Amherst and University of Vermont put it out. And in this document, they talk about carbon storage and carbon sequestration. So that should be clear to you now. The storage is how carbon accumulates in those carbon pools, and they talk about it as an amount. And then carbon sequestration is how much carbon is removed from the air every year, and they talk about that as a rate. And they make a statement in here that I think confuses a lot of people. It says the rate at which a forest sequesters carbon typically peaks when forests are young to intermediate age, 30 to 70 years old. And again, they're talking about rate, not volume, so we'll take a look at that. But it's led a lot of people to think, well, young, fast-growing forests sequester more carbon, right? So we should cut forests to make them younger so they sequester more carbon. And that is not what this is saying. So let me walk you through, how it actually works here. Now, whenever I get confused, and it is confusing, I like to go back to this study that was done by Beverly Law and her team at Oregon State. It was done on a western forest type, a ponderosa pine forest in western Oregon. So it doesn't store as much carbon as an eastern forest, and I'll show you the comparisons in a minute. But they meticulously measured every carbon pool and every flux, from the leaves to the fine roots to the trunk, and that really helped. So what they did was they had a forest, and they had an area of very old forest. So it was mixed age, but 50 to 250-year-old old forest you see on the left. And then they also had an area that had been clear cut about 20 years ago. And first they measured the carbon stock, so you can see it here. They measured the soils, the roots, the woody debris, the litter, the trunk and branches, and the foliage. And in that old forest, there's a lot of carbon stock, about 20,000 grams of carbon per meter squared. And then they measured those same stocks in the young forest, and you can see there's still a pretty good stock in the soil and roots, but it has shrunk a little from the old forest. There's a nice woody debris amount, and that's probably a lot of stuff left over from the cutting. And then it's missing its sort of trunk and litter and foliage, and it ends up being about half of the stock. And the next thing they did was they measured those fluxes, and here you can see both of them. if you remember, it's the leaf area index that really drives how much carbon is coming in. So the old forest has a larger leaf area index than the new forest, but they're both bringing carbon in. And then they measured the fluxes out. And so here you see in the old forest, the flux out is the soil respiration, the litter and trunk, and the foliage. And what they found was, if you subtract the carbon coming in and the carbon going out, it's sequestering about 28 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. When they looked at the young forest, they noticed that what was coming in was not as high as what was going out. So there was still a lot of soil respiration and tree respiration. And at this point, there was not enough leaf area index to offset the carbon being lost through respiration. And so the forest actually had a negative 32 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And they concluded from this that it takes about 20 to 30 years before the forest gets up to a carbon neutral state. So it's losing carbon. Okay, so now I think we have a general model for a forest sequestration after a disturbance or a harvest. So across the bottom of this graph is years, 0 to 80 years. And this line, the gray line in the middle, is the 0 point. Below that line, the system is losing carbon. Above that, it's sequestering carbon. It's gaining carbon. And we can say after a harvest or disturbance, the wood starts growing, the trees start growing back, but they're still losing carbon because of respiration until it hits the point where it crosses the gray line, where the leaf area is enough to offset the respiration. And at that point, the forest starts to gain carbon. And it gains it at a fast rate. You see the line going up, it gets larger and larger every year. So it increases every year. And from somewhere from 30 to 70, that's the point that foresters are often talking about. That's the area of highest rate of carbon accumulation. And eventually it hits a point where this accumulated carbon can offset the carbon losses of the first 30 years. I called it the neutral point. At that point, you've grown a bunch of new wood, and the rapid rate has offset the initial rate, so you have carbon of 0. You neither sequestered nor did you leave any, so you grew new wood with no carbon cost. Now, it's not as much sequestration as if you were just the steady rate across the top is an old forest, just accumulating carbon every year at a flat rate. So the rate is slower, but the amount is larger. Now let's look at storage. So, why would you do this? You do this to get wood. Now, I love wood. I use wood for heating, for building, for furniture, for guitars. Wood is a great material. And if we look at the storage, you've grown a bunch of new wood. That's the green. That's the amount of new wood you've grown. Also in your carbon stock, you have soil carbon. So you've probably lost some soil carbon from the cutting, and it probably has not grown back as fast because you've been reallocating it to new wood, which is great. And then you have some of the original wood that you harvest still left. And according, to a 2011 study, that can be about 20%. You lose carbon in the as wood is processed and transported, and created into products, you lose a certain amount of the carbon. So after 80 years, maybe 20% is left. So you have a pretty decent carbon stock here. Now, it doesn't compare with the stock if the forest was just left alone undisturbed, because you would have the original stock of above ground wood, you would have the original soil stock, and you would have all the carbon that you sequestered over that time, and so that's why you can say the carbon storage is greater in an old forest, but the rate is faster, in the 30 to 70 years growing of a young forest. So again, it's the rate, not the amount. Okay, so finally, the variation in sequestration and stock it differs by forest type. So here's a graph of different forest types. The bars are the carbon stock, and the 3 bars on the right are for coniferous forest. There's a spruce forest in Maine, and then there's the Oregon old and young pine forest. And you can see they have slightly lower carbon stocks than the 3 bars on the left, which are for a deciduous forest and 2 mixed forests in New York and New Hampshire. And they tend to have larger carbon stocks just by forest type. And then the dotted line and the numbers you see are the sequestration rates that have been estimated for the next 20 years. And you can see that you have higher sequestration rates in our broadleaf forest and mixed forest than in the coniferous forest. And so to actually apply that model in your thinking, you'd have to adjust for the forest type that you are looking at. But the general principles hold, but the details matter, and it's important to look at the different details. So summary so far, trees extract carbon in proportion to their leaf area. So leaf area index is really everything. Complex old forests are designed to maximize the annual uptake. Forest stands sequester and store carbon every year. A young stand allocates more carbon to wood production, whereas an old stand allocates more carbon to the roots, to its neighbors, and to the mycorrhizal network. So there's a whole underground thing going on with carbon as the forest gets older and older. Old forests do store a lot of carbon, but there are ways to grow and harvest trees that minimize sequestration losses and provide wood products. It all takes time. So let's take a big step back in the carbon cycle. We talked about Joseph Priestley discovering photosynthesis in the 1770s. In 1970, Joni Mitchell released an album, Woodstock, or released a song, Woodstock, really. And in that song, she says, "We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon." She's actually quoting Carl Sagan, who around this same time, he and other scientists worked out that there's really not that much carbon in the universe. The universe is mostly hydrogen and helium, and that carbon is produced when stars explode. When stars go nova, a little bit of carbon is created in the implosion, and that somehow a little bit of carbon found our rocky planet and got into the atmosphere around the planet, and somehow life evolved, particularly plants, to extract that carbon out of the atmosphere to create our green and living planet, and we are totally dependent for food, for materials, and for oxygen on plant life that extracting that carbon. So as Joni said, we are golden, but we're caught in the devil's bargain. And how do we get ourselves back to the garden? Well, that's the question I want to ask for the next couple of slides. First of all, we should conserve all the irrecoverable carbon. And what I mean by irrecoverable carbon is carbon that if we lose it now, we're not going to get it back in any realistic time. We're trying to get carbon out of the atmosphere. People are developing all sorts of new ways to do that. They are expensive and slow, and really the greatest thing we can do is just keep the carbon in the ground in those big systems. And you can see here, this is a great little chart that came from this paper. This is a 2020 paper, Goldstein et al. And the density of the carbon, we've been talking a lot about old forests being dense with carbon. You'll see the densest carbon are really mangroves and our peatlands, all that sphagnum, as well as old forests. So if you look at the other axis here, you'll see how much total carbon stock is out there on the globe. And you see again, old forests and peatlands have dense carbon stocks, and there's a lot of it out there, and we should really try and keep that in the ground. You see here seagrass, grasslands, marshes. They are not as dense and there is not as much out there. I mean, we should protect all the carbon in my opinion, but if we have to prioritize, start with this irrecoverable dense carbon. Where are those stocks in the US? Well, the biggest forest carbon stocks are in the Pacific Northwest, and followed by the stocks in New England and the Appalachians. And we should focus on keeping those stocks in the ground. If you look at soil carbon, it's a little bit of a different picture. At least you see the big peatlands in northern Maine and the Adirondacks, in the Everglades. Those are also big soil stocks that we should try and keep in the ground. To help you do this, we've recently released, to help you think about carbon, we've released a carbon calculator that was developed, some amazing data sets developed by Chris Williams and Natalia Hosler at Clark University. They've shared this data set. We put it into our resilient land mapping tool. And with that tool, you can go into anywhere in the US and you can import a shapefile or you can sketch a polygon. You can see that little shape up here in red is Binney Hill. You can sketch it and click on it and it will calculate and estimate carbon for you. So you can see Binney Hill, you can see the below ground, above ground, and woody debris estimates, and you can see what it would likely sequester over the next 40 years if there is no disturbance, if it was just left alone to grow. And you can get estimates for all that. So I encourage you to play with this and start thinking about carbon in your own conservation. And that's why you've probably heard, the cheapest, fastest way to get carbon out of our atmosphere is, first of all, just to avoid forest conversion. So if you look at this dark bar next to avoid forest conversion and natural forest management, those bars are kind of the low-cost areas for getting carbon out of the atmosphere. And you see avoiding forest conversion or just keeping forest as forest is the cheapest way with the largest impact, but also better forest management of the type we've talked about now, ways to have longer rotations or keep carbon in the ground. I'll notice that the top bar, reforestation of areas that don't have forest and putting forest back has a lot of potential. It is, however, much more expensive and slower, so well, you can do your own calculations. A couple of things that have come up, for carbon-friendly forestry: longer rotations, retaining, old trees, or retaining more leaf area, or managing for structural complexity, all good things. Really starting to manage for soils and think about how we maintain soil carbon, and then also whole cycle management, thinking about how wood is lost during the wood products life cycle and trying to minimize losses. And it's really going to take all of our different strategies if we want to get carbon out of the atmosphere and work with nature to do it. So, permanent protected lands where the forest really can grow dense with carbon and old is a very small part of the conservation picture. And that's the part that Northeast Wilderness Trust really focuses on. It's the only land trust in the Northeast that is focused, specifically on forever wild fee ownership and easements that will allow old forests to grow back. But we also need very well managed multiple use lands. So we need our public and private use lands to be managed with carbon in mind. That can also get a lot of carbon back on the landscape. And we need our sustainably managed private lands. Private forest harvesting can use better practices for biodiversity. And it's going to take all three of these strategies really to get anywhere near our potential for getting carbon out of the atmosphere and keeping it in the ground. So I started this presentation by reminding you that trees were living beings, and now I hope you see that forests are living communities that are designed to extract and store carbon. It's what they do, it's what they eat, it's what we eat, and they've been doing it for a long time, longer than humans have been around. So I'd like to think about going forward with trees as a partnership to extract carbon. And ideally, it should be a reciprocal partnership. Although it's easy to list everything we get from trees and plants, I haven't quite figured out what they get from us. So if any of you have ideas on that, I would love to hear from you. As Aldo Leopold said, we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.